All right, we're going live a little early. If you are joining, we are going to take a couple minutes before we get started to make sure everyone can tune in. All right, as people are hopping on, I'm not sure if it's not quite 5 o'clock yet, but we are going to wait another couple minutes. Hopefully people are hopping on, tuning in, and we'll get started a little bit after 5. All right, it's 5 o'clock. I hope people are tuning in. We are going to get started maybe in about a minute just to make sure everyone's good to go. We started this a little bit early just to give people time to hop on. All right, we're getting a couple people on. Welcome. All right. I think we're good to get started. So welcome to all of you guys who are tuning in. Hopefully we have people coming on as they are able. My name is Kara Halsey, and I am the Director of Clinical Education and Training with IB Rehab, and we are putting on this discussion today about the burnout cycle. It's going to be the burnout cycle as it relates to healthcare, but specifically the physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy fields. I am a physical therapist by trade. I've been a PT for 11 years, and I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia. So go Eagles. So welcome to the chat today, and we'll get started. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to define burnout and what we're deeming the burnout cycle. We're going to discuss 5 causes of burnout. We're going to review the consequences of burnout in healthcare. And then the most important part, we're going to discuss 5 strategies to mitigate or potentially prevent burnout. All right, so why are we talking about this? Why is this such a hot topic? So there's some data coming out that is specifically for physical therapy, but since 2010, there's been a 186% increase in DPT, or doctorate of physical therapy graduates from accredited institutions. And each year, these programs graduate over 10,000 students. However, our national association estimated back in 2019 that over 26,000 jobs will not be able to be filled by this year, by 2025. So that was their prediction back in 2019. And I think things have changed even more since then. So we have a shortage of therapists. There's a high demand of therapists. So that low number coupled with that high demand, coupled with the fact that our therapists are burning out, and on top of that, our current therapists are making up for the shortage. So they're seeing more patients. We've got reimbursement cuts. We've got administrative additions it seems like a day-to-day basis. And we're a healthcare field. So there's a higher prevalence of burnout in general. So I think that's the relevance of why we're talking about this and why we've deemed it this cycle that we really need to address. In the literature, these three topics are tightly correlated. So you're looking at compassion fatigue here, imposter syndrome, and burnout. And you can technically look at each of these topics as a separate issue, and we can probably do a whole presentation on each of these topics. But for today, the purpose of this presentation, we really looked at it as burnout being the end result of compassion fatigue and imposter syndrome. Those are potential causes. They do lead right into each other. So you can start anywhere on this cycle. And we're going to kind of dive into that today and how can we recognize the symptoms and what can we do about it. So this is the definition of burnout. There's three components to it. There was a scale designed in 1981 by two psychologists that were looking to assess different aspects of burnout syndrome. They administered the scale to a wide range of human services professionals, and three subscales emerged from that data analysis. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on those three subscales. And this is Maslow and Jackson's definition from that scale designed in 1981. About 88% of the current research publications are utilizing this definition and Maslow's burnout inventory scale. So that is also why we chose to focus on that definition. But it's worth noting that the World Health Organization has declared burnout an occupational phenomenon, and they have their own definition, which is very similar to the one that we're going to go through today. They have recently updated their definition because this is becoming a global phenomenon, an occupational phenomenon, and they're really recognizing it as a relevant health issue that's leading to negative effects and raising concern for patient safety. So that's a quote from the World Health Organization. And I think it just shows, it's kind of setting the stage for this presentation, that this is not just a you issue. If you're tuning in and you're experiencing burnout, it's not just a clinic issue. If you're tuning in and your clinicians, you're a leader, an owner, and your clinicians are experiencing burnout, it's industry-wide, global issue. So this is across various work settings. And although our focus today is healthcare and the rehab industry, we will talk about how this is a bigger, more umbrella issue. So emotional exhaustion is the first piece of burnout, and emotional exhaustion example of this would be feeling drained or depleted even after rest. You have reduced motivation, you're having decreased productivity. It can even manifest into physical symptoms. This emotional exhaustion piece, it feels like the simplest tasks are hard, and it's just leading to clinicians missing deadlines, a reduced quality of work, and reduced productivity, which is probably the biggest issue when it comes to emotional exhaustion. I like to use examples when we talk about this stuff, right? Instead of just the broad definition. So an example of this would be a clinician that's going home after work and going straight to bed, right? It might be 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 7 p.m., and they're just drained and they're going right to bed. It could be also a clinician who is not usually the one to be calling out sick all the time or not showing up to work. And that starts to be a pattern for that person. So those are some examples of the emotional exhaustion piece and the physical exhaustion piece of burnout. The next piece is depersonalization, and this looks a lot like the consequences of the emotional exhaustion on the previous slide. However, our patients are the individuals who are feeling the effects most acutely of depersonalization. So they're feeling reduced empathy in the way that they're treated. They're noticing a lack of therapeutic alliance, and those things are going to lead to patients being less satisfied with their care. And we feel like this is where the most detrimental consequences really are arising, and that safety risk that the World Health Organization has deemed an occupational phenomenon. So we know how important therapeutic alliance is. We know how important connecting with our patients is to create positive outcomes and successful patient care. So if we're not achieving that, then we can say that this part of burnout is leading to a decrease in successful patient outcomes. Examples of this would be when a clinician feels detached or disconnected from the patient. The patient feels like they're being treated in a very mechanical manner. Patients are not finishing their care. They're dropping off. They're not finishing all the way to their discharge. And a clinician you'll see this in the clinic, whether you're a clinician or an owner or a leader, you'll see patient or clinicians being really focused on their computer, right? When they should be focused on the patient. Just everything is, I'm getting my notes done, I'm doing this, and they're not connecting with that patient. We also see this when clinicians are not putting in, effort that they normally put in, or the effort required to be a great clinician. That could look like not doing chart reviews. So it's important to prep for our patients, especially if we're covering for patients. We need to kind of be doing that prep work, be putting the effort in before we see our patients, planning for each of our visits. And you're not seeing that when a clinician is feeling burnout, and it could be detrimental to patient safety. If you think about a clinician who needs to be guarding a patient or be really paying attention to a patient and how they're reacting to a specific intervention, and they're not connected, that could be a huge safety issue. The last piece of burnout is reduced personal accomplishment. And so this is a clinician feeling really inefficient and feeling like what they're doing has no value, even if their patients are being successful, completing their plan of care. The clinician starts to feel self-doubt. They're losing their confidence and they're feeling powerless. That's the word that really stuck with me in this component of burnout. They feel like they can't make change. So why do I even try? And what you're going to see here as a leader, as a clinician, is they're not going to want to raise their hand for extra responsibilities. They're not going to want to move up within the company or move up within the structure of, like, however you structure your clinicians to become an advanced clinician. They don't want to put the time and effort into their education or their skill advancement. So that can have a profound effect on a business. So not taking advantage of those things could affect both the clinician and their quality of care, and then the business and not being able to grow their staff. So those are the three components of burnout and kind of what you might see for each of those symptoms. And I thought it was important to kind of just show how we measure burnout with the Maslach burnout inventory, because I had mentioned 88% of our research publications are utilizing this. So it is recognized as a leading measure of burnout. It's validated by over 35 years of research, and the analyses that have been done on it are showing that it's got high reliability and validity as a measure of burnout. And so it actually goes through 22 symptoms related to those three dimensions that we just talked about. And there are different forms for different populations, like human service populations, even the general population. So I included a link here, and I'll make sure that our team makes this available when we conclude here, because you can go, and it's a really cool site that you can compare which version is best for me. So if I'm individually looking to measure my own burnout symptoms, or I'm a leader and I'm looking to measure maybe my clinic or my region's burnout and try to intervene. So that's an awesome tool, and it is a paid tool, just an FYI. So you can head over to that link and see kind of what the options are. And it's pretty quick. It does only take about 10 minutes to complete. So really cool tool. Wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of it. So moving on to the causes of burnout, we chose 5. And now we know that there are more than 5 causes of burnout, but we decided to take a look at a qualitative study that was done in 2024, so pretty recently, titled Perceptions and Experiences of Burnout in PTs. And there were 202 individuals that participated, and 10 themes emerged for the causes of burnout. So we looked and we were like, okay, what's relevant in today's society? And then what's more controllable, right? I want you guys to leave anytime I do this talk. I want you to leave with actual strategies to mitigate or prevent burnout. So that's why we picked these 5. And then something interesting also I like to mention is that there is a pretty popular Harvard Business Review article that references the 6 causes of burnout. And so we took a look at that article, which is, not referencing the healthcare field, but a much broader field. And we kind of lined up, okay, what are the overlapping causes of burnout? So that's how we came to these 5. And it's just another way that we're seeing how global of an issue that this is. And it's not just us in healthcare. So the first cause that we're going to look into, and I think the most important one, I think we'll spend the most time here, is the workload in healthcare. And the first one is lack of rest, and that's often seen in physicians and nurses who are working that 12 to 24 hour or sometimes more shifts. And I know that rehab professionals do sometimes work like long hour shifts like that, maybe 10 hours, but it's less likely that they're working these shifts. But research is showing that is leading to greater burnout. And what I think is also promising is that you're seeing these big hospital groups and these physician groups kind of addressing that. And there is hope that there is going to be some implementation of more rest periods or shorter working shifts to combat that burnout. But what I want to focus on, I think, which is more of a direct change that we can do today or tomorrow, is the dreaded word productivity standards. So from a personal mission of mine, I've been, a PT for 11 years. I'm on a mission to remove the negative connotation with the word productivity. So I really do feel, it's in my opinion, that we're missing something in the healthcare kind of academic journey that prepares us providers for real world productivity standards. So we know that it needs to start at the academic level. There's a little bit of a piece missing there. It's also missing from the organizational level when it comes to academia, right? Like when we take on students and we're clinical instructors, I've often seen clinical instructors kind of protecting their students from productivity standards or numbers and focusing 100% of their attention on hands-on clinical skills. And I think we're doing students a little bit of a disservice when they get out into the real world. I think it's really fair to have productivity standards. It's something that you can expect in any industry, in any role. As I was prepping for this presentation, I ask others in my circle what their productivity standards are at their, place of work. And an example would be my husband. His productivity standards are called sales and client retention quotas. And then my mom, she's a teacher, and she is measured on her students' standardized testing grades. So a measurement is important, and it's something that we should expect. But when it comes to healthcare, what we're seeing in the research and what I really want to talk about today is that the more connected our productivity standards are to quality of care, to clinical excellence, the less likely clinicians are to experience burnout. And we feel, and maybe you guys in the audience feel like you've always known that, and yes, that's what we do, but we're seeing it come out in the research. So to have data to back this up is groundbreaking, in my opinion. So very excited to see that this is coming out, and I'm on a crusade to get this message out to both clinicians, to students, to schools, to organizations, that we really need to start talking about productivity standards earlier and from a quality perspective. So Productivity is not negative. It's actually quite necessary. We use it to ensure that we're providing appropriate access to care, appropriate intensity of treatment, plan of care completions, and successful patient outcomes. So when a company emphasizes those things along with their productivity, they're going to have a less burned out workforce. What I'll do, and when I do these talks, I have done some talks in the Philadelphia area to as guest lecturer to schools, to TPT programs, and I will pull up every metric depending on how much time I have. I will pull up every metric that a student might encounter, and we will discuss how that represents quality care. So I did want to do that today with you guys, and in the interest of time, I'll probably just do one or two. But I picked the one that might not resonate right away with you as a clinician, especially our newer clinicians. How could billing and coding standards actually represent quality care? And I think the most important thing here is, first and foremost, wherever you are, whether you're a leader or a clinician, the message, the foundational message when it comes to billing and coding should be bill what you do, nothing more, nothing less, right? So we have to start there. So let's all agree that that's where we're starting. But taking it a step further, how can this represent quality of care? You know, I've talked to clinicians that I've mentored and coached that a lot of times their feedback is, well, you're just telling me how to bill. You're just telling me what to bill. And it's very important we as administrators and leaders are not doing that, but we're discussing billing and coding in the way that it should be discussed from a patient care perspective. CPT coding will paint a picture. It will tell us a story of what you're doing and what you've performed with your patients. So depending on the model, and I can speak just today from an outpatient therapy perspective, your codes should reflect what your treatment model is. And so for my most recent experience, our treatment model is about 1 hour of treatment with our patients. That is an average, but that's how we schedule. And so we should see that reflected in our coding. We want to see coding that emphasizes quality care, right? So that means we want to make sure that we're educating patients. So we should see coding that comes across that includes patient education. We want to see appropriate clinical care that's diverse. Not every patient is going to get the same exact treatment. So when we see those diversified codes and we see one-on-one codes, we know that that patient is likely getting a quality visit. We also like to see re-evals, progress evals, formal discharge coding, because that's telling us that we are addressing and progressing patients and that these are happening on a standardized or regular basis. So even if we're not getting reimbursed on the back end for that, billing and coding that as a clinician tells insurance companies, utilization reviewers, leaders that they are doing those re-evals and consistently assessing their patients. So it's important to code and bill what we do, nothing more, nothing less. Another example I will use here this is more for our clinicians getting out into the field. What we look at when we look at billing and coding averages, right? So sometimes we can't always have specific clinical discussions looking at very specific patients on their billing and coding, but we can look at averages and a month of what units you're billing, what type of units. So when we look, we want to know from both ends. So a lot of clinicians attach to this, they're telling me I'm not billing enough, and they're telling me I need to bill more. And that is not the message that needs to be discussed. It's more so, okay, we've got a bell curve, right? We've got a company average that matches our model of care, right? And most of our clinicians are in that large part of the bell curve, but we look at both sides. We're going to look at that small percentage of clinicians who maybe aren't meeting the standards for various reasons. It could just be billing education. It could be that they're not providing comprehensive treatment, right? It could be a lot of different things. We're also looking at the other side of things too. Are we billing more than the company average? And what do those outcomes look like? Because likely, and in my experience, I'm not quoting any data here, those clinicians are not you know, seeing better outcomes. It's really the clinicians that are providing the comprehensive care and then the side of the bell curve that we want to address. And as a clinician, we should be open to that. We should be open to learning about how to bill and code appropriately. We should be open to reflecting on if we are doing it appropriately, and if we feel clinically confident in our billing and coding, we can have those discussions with leaders. And then as leaders and administrators, we should feel confident in supporting our clinicians with education and making sure that the billing and coding is coming from a quality perspective and not a numbers perspective. So I get very passionate about these things, and in the interest of time, I will move on to how self-discharge standards can represent quality of care. And I will quickly just mention that there are some questions here, right, that we can ask ourselves as clinicians if we find ourselves having a high self-discharge rate. Are we creating a therapeutic alliance? Are we creating the rapport that we need to? When are our patients self-discharging? To set the scene, self-discharging meaning they're not meeting their goals. Is it early on in the plan of care? Is it super late in the plan of care? It tells a story, and we can reflect on how we can improve on our quality of care. We want our patients to get to the end of their plan of care and to get to successful discharge. So if there's something I can do, and a lot of times I use the example of motivational interviewing, when I was a clinician treating full-time in the clinic, that was not something I knew about. But when it was brought up in a discussion with a leader or with my team, that was a supportive way, like, hey, maybe we should try motivational interviewing, and that might improve our patient outcomes or improve patient adherence to plan of care. When you're talking about it like that, it's much easier to receive and make a behavior change because you know that it's going to be in the best interest of your patients. So really important that we come from a quality perspective, and really important that you think of it as from a quality perspective if you're a clinician, because I will also say not every leader is going to come to their clinicians in this fashion. So it's important for you to reframe how you think about these quality standards and then present that back to whoever, is talking to you about metrics or performance measures in your organization. So moving on, that was the big one, guys. The next cause is lack of control. And there was a study done by Brown et al. In Canada with occupational therapists in 2017 that showed when autonomy decreases, burnout increases. So when the job requires, high job demands, but it has a low decision latitude, that's a major source of emotional fatigue. So they saw in this study that positive effects occurred when employees had control over more aspects of their job. So when they increased the decision-making capabilities and work autonomy, they saw that workers were allowed to exert more influence over the stressful parts of their job, and therefore reduce burnout and have more engaged, happier employees. Another interesting thing that they noted in this study was that across the board, therapists are trained to apply a high level of autonomous and collaborative clinical decision-making, but anecdotally, they were not seeing that happen in work environments, in workplaces. They were seeing a significant difference in what clinicians are trained for and what they're actually allowed to do in the workplace. So I think filling that gap is super important to preventing burnout. And this might be more from an administrative level, but I will give you an example of how you can do it if you're a clinician in the clinic, a staff clinician. So technical autonomy just means being able to clinically decide what your patient needs. And so an example of that would be physicians having the autonomy to prescribe medication. We think, and I think personally, that rehab clinicians don't always have full autonomy to prescribe a patient plan of care. So it's really important that we are working based off of the clinical competence of our clinicians, and they're prescribing the plan of care that is most clinically appropriate. And that's going to give them some technical autonomy. Another example of this would be, and this is something that's just been in my experience, the lack of control over your schedule. So it's important to note that companies are most of the time putting the schedule, 100% of the scheduling onto their front office. Sometimes companies even outsource scheduling, and that is all like efficient business, right? And it can make a clinician feel like they don't have control or any autonomy over their schedule. But it's also not realistic to think that a clinician who's treating patients all day can schedule all their patients too. So what I found to be successful for myself is really building a relationship with the front desk. And that's every front desk person that comes through your clinic, right? So temp people, night people, full-time people, build a relationship with them, consistently walk up to the desk, walk your patients up to the desk, talk to them about how you like your schedule, right? Like, you know your schedule best. It ebbs and flows. Sometimes you have a huge caseload of kids coming after school, so you're less busy in the morning, and you're asking your front desk to put those IEs in the morning, or vice versa. Having that collaborative experience with them is going to give you a little bit of autonomy and could help reduce that burnout. So the next cause would be lack of reward. And we do want to quickly acknowledge the debt burden in the industry, PT specifically from my research. But what's promising is that schools and organizations are beginning to offer resources for this. So an example would be, I just went to the national conference for PT in Houston in February, and there was an entire session, maybe multiple, on financial planning once you get out of school, once you're a new grad. And the APTA has a ton of resources. I'm sure ASHA and AOTA have a ton of resources. There's even financial advisors that are coming out that are saying they specialize in advising physical therapists. So looking for those resources, seeing what you could do proactively about the debt burden and finances. I just want to address it. We could talk, hours about that, but for this presentation, it is a cause of burnout within our industry. Compensation, though, isn't always everything. So let's talk about rewards and recognition. And this is most important, especially early on in your career. Making sure that you're working for a company that is investing in you and investing in your advancement. So it could be monetary rewards. It could be administrative hour rewards, depending on, certain goalposts that you meet, certain education that you take. If you further your skills into a specialty or a residency, rewarding you for that is very important. And it is starting to address burnout within clinical care. I put the example of the career ladder up here because that's just an example of what my experience is currently and how we are advancing our clinicians at Ivy. But it could look lots of different ways. It could be mentorship opportunities. It could be non-clinical opportunities. So looking for those rewards that aren't always full compensation is going to help prevent or mitigate burnout. So moving on to the big ones, right? Compassion fatigue and imposter syndrome. So compassion fatigue is defined as a phenomenon that clinicians experience behavioral and emotional changes due to repeated exposure to secondhand trauma from the clients with whom they're working. And so there was a study done in 2023 by Kermachi et al. That evaluated compassion fatigue for the first time in PTs, and they found that as compassion fatigue increases, job satisfaction decreases and exhaustion increases. And so we can say that compassion fatigue is leading to burnout. Another phrase here that goes hand in hand with burnout, and especially in our industry, is something called emotional dissonance. And that is the psychological concept that refers to the conflict between a person's true emotions and the emotions they display to conform to social or professional expectations. So essentially, that means you have patients in front of you all day, and some of them are very pleasant and some of them are very difficult. And you have to completely be professional and push down any emotions that you really want to say, right? Emotional dissonance you could say it happens all day, every day in everybody's life. I mean, customer service representatives, they probably have a high emotional dissonance job, but it definitely is a large component of healthcare. So there was a study done by Fiabain et al. That showed as emotional dissonance increased, exhaustion and burnout increased. So that correlated emotional dissonance to burnout. And what they found was that the perception of quality care will mitigate emotional dissonance. So if we're talking to our clinicians in a quality manner, we are reducing our odds for burnout. And then Kim et al. Did a study in 2020 that found the greater the emotional dissonance, the more likely the person will experience imposter syndrome. So that is our last cause. And we are going to talk about it as imposter phenomenon, because that is actually the specific term. It was coined by two psychology students in 1978, and they coined it the phenomenon because they didn't want it to be misinterpreted as a syndrome in the medical sense. It's not something that can be diagnosed. It's actually a feeling of perceived fraudulence. And imposter syndrome is tightly correlated with burnout throughout the literature, and it's truly defined as ongoing fear or exposure as a fraud or imposter, despite objective successes and accomplishments. So one study I looked at actually referenced about 70% of people in general will experience imposter phenomenon at some point in their life. And I thought that was a wildly high number. And I then came across this lovely quote from Albert Einstein. And he's quoted saying, "I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler." So Albert Einstein himself had imposter phenomenon, or you can assume he might have had some feelings of imposter phenomenon. And so we can call it imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon, or that you're feeling like an involuntary swindler. So I actually thought that quote was pretty funny. Moving on to some serious research. Anderson et al. In 2023 did a study on physical therapy specifically. So we are seeing a growing interest of this specific topic in medicine, but definitely not within the rehab world. So this was a great study to look at, pretty large study of 520 clinicians. And you could see here that over 50% of those clinicians reported intense or frequent imposter syndrome feelings. So that's a large number in my mind. And they found some specifics to what's going to increase the likelihood of experiencing IP and decrease it. So first one is pretty self-explanatory. It felt obvious to me, right? The greater length of time held in a professional position, the less likely you are to experience IP. The second one is interesting too. They said they found a sweet spot of 11 to 20 years of experience where people were less likely to experience IP. And so anybody out there that does not have 11 years of experience yet, don't worry. This is not a study that we are, hanging our hat on. They're just making observations. And it goes hand in hand with any job, right? The more experience you have in any job, the more likely you are, less likely you are to experience IP. I think about it as a parent, right? I have two small kids, and I just think about as they get older, I'm like, oh, I might be getting a little bit better at this parenting thing. So you think about it like that, imposter syndrome, the more experience you have, the less likely you're going to experience imposter syndrome. Another unique thing that they found was that having managerial or supervisory experience decreased IP by 45%, which I thought was a huge number. And it just gets you thinking, right? Like, why? Why is that? Can we do more research into what those people, what skills they might have? Is it because they have more mentorship from leaders outside of clinical care? It's a really interesting piece that I found from this study. And then the things that increase the likelihood of imposter phenomenon were moderate to high levels of emotional exhaustion. So here we are at that burnout cycle. It's all correlated. Having a master's or bachelor's degree versus having a doctorate, which is now the standard, and having a history or a current mental health diagnosis. So interesting observations in this study, and I think it just leads us to back to this cycle that we're talking about. It's all leading into each other. And I took a quote directly from one of the psychology books that I had referenced. Imposter syndrome can contribute to the development and progression of burnout, which in turn can exacerbate imposter feelings. So we're just seeing through all of this how tightly correlated, how cyclical these topics are, and where can we intervene and recognize these symptoms to mitigate this, to prevent this. So that leads us right into our next section. This is the last of it. And before we get there, I did want to just mention a really strong study done by Lee et al. In 2024. It was a large systematic review, 85 studies, over 288,000 nurses, and they found that burnout was correlated with more infections, more patient falls, more medication errors, and more adverse events. And those associations were consistent across all variables. So it did not matter the experience level those nurses had, their age, where they worked, their sex, anything like that. It was pretty telling that burnout is causing a lower patient safety climate, which is why this is an occupational phenomenon, which is why we're talking about it today. It also leads to other negative effects, which would be just decreased patient satisfaction, increased costs for companies, and increased turnover. So administrators, leaders, owners should be paying attention to this and should be trying to mitigate this in the same fashion that we as clinicians are as well. So diving into the coping and prevention strategies, we're going to talk about 5. And I think it's important just to set the stage that we do believe that the mitigation piece, this piece, is a shared responsibility between us as clinicians, what we're doing day to day, and equally our organizations, our administrators, the industry, the APTA, ASHA, AOTA. We kind of have to come together on this. It's not one person or the other. And the healthcare industry is doing a good job, especially in the last couple of years, of putting research out that is identifying what burnout is, what is causing it, but it's not doing a great job of telling us how to intervene, what are interventions, what are management programs we can put into place. So for this presentation, we actually went to the psychology research, where there's a lot more research over a lot longer period of time, back to the 70s and 80s, of how we can combat this. So the first strategy is what we're deeming setting expectations. And there's 2 psychological theories here that we're going to talk about. And the first one, I think, is a relatable example. The internet and social media have created these unrealistic expectations for all of us across all areas of life, right? Not even just looks. I brought this one up because it went viral on TikTok, and I remember this TikTok filter called bold glamour. And so if our expectations are not set in reality, we are much more likely to be disappointed, to be exhausted, to be depressed. And we are definitely seeing that in the social media realm. Research is coming out about the younger generations who have been on social media for a longer time. So return to reality really means we have to work on abandoning the idea of perfection. So an example that would be for a clinician would be a PT or an OT or a speech therapist gets out of school and they expect to see patients at their leisure, right? Without any performance standards, no metrics to worry about, and they're going to get paid way above market value. Okay, but PTB or OTB or SLPB comes out of the same school, the same program, and expects that there will be quality metrics that they're going to have to discuss. And they're going to be excited to work up the clinical ladder. They don't expect to be a super experienced clinician day one. They know they're going to have to put work into it. And they're expecting to be paid market value. They did their research. They know what market value is in their area. They're confident in themselves. They're going to negotiate for, a little bit more than market value, but they have different expectations than PTA. So PTA is much more likely to experience burnout much quicker than PTB. So it's setting those expectations for ourselves as clinicians, and then also setting those expectations from a higher level in academia, in organizations. And then the self-awareness theory is complex, so I'm not going to get fully into it, but it's basically the study of consequences when we focus attention all on ourselves. It's a very extreme way of thinking, a self way of thinking. And the literature shows that when we step out of that extreme self-thinking and reframe our negative thoughts, challenge our negative thoughts, we can see more clearly and reduce the symptoms of burnout. So that exhaustion, that depression, physical symptoms. But we have to work at it. So self-awareness theory is also, they deem it like a muscle, right? Like we have to work at it just like we would have to work out a muscle. So we got to understand our extreme thought process and then work on a daily basis to reframe that. So I like to use the example here of my company only cares about numbers. Like that's a very extreme thought. And if we can reframe that and say, okay, my company cares about more about numbers than I do, but I know that there's a quality care aspect to these numbers. That's like, the perfect way to take an extreme thought and reframe it, hopefully from what you learned today during this talk. And another example, this one might be a little bit more relatable to everyone out there, but how many of you guys have thought, oh my gosh, this is the worst EMR system I have ever used? You could take this extreme, right? My company must have chose this EMR system because they wanted to make our lives harder. Like that extreme thinking can be reframed to, my company chose this EMR system for a reason. It may not be a reason that I care about, but I understand that they chose this for a reason. And so I am going to create efficiencies for myself. I am going to take the initiative and do what I can, what I have control over to create those efficiencies. And so that leads us right into the next strategy of creating efficiencies. And I really focused on documentation here because as a leader, as someone who's been part of conversations on evaluating EMR systems or any new administrative requirements, our thought process is not what makes it harder on the clinician. Sometimes we have to understand each other's perspectives, right? I do have the perspective of being in the clinic, and I always think about our clinicians when we are evaluating these, but you have to think compliantly and financially first, right? What's going to keep us compliant and what's going to get us paid? In order to serve patients and even get a chance to make a difference in someone's life, we have to think compliantly and financially. And that's okay. I think we need to talk about that more. I want clinicians to know that that's why we picked this EMR. And we're going to do our best to also make it work for you as the clinician. You are just as important as the compliance and financial piece, but that has to come first. Uses, or if they switch EMR systems. I tell people I probably have tried every EMR system on the market, and I've been a part of a lot of transitions. And I've had those extreme negative thoughts, but what I have done is I've made documentation a complete priority for myself. So you have to take initiative. You have to have control over your templates, over your autofill, quick keys, talking to text, or any sort of dictation that you could do within your EMR system. Keeping your documentation short and sweet. Learning how to be efficient with your words. Point of service documentation, making sure that you're documenting with the patient. It's a skill to be able to give the patient the engagement that they need while also documenting. So working on those skills, putting this as a priority for yourself, it may take some upfront work, but in the long run, you're going to see those efficiencies pay off, and it's really going to be beneficial for those burnout symptoms. I think we can absolutely do a better job here as an industry. So all the fighting and the lobbying that the APTA is doing to decrease administrative burdens is extremely helpful. And we are hopefully seeing this improve as time goes on. But I do think it ultimately is on the clinician when it comes to being proactive about being efficient with their documentation. And then one of the reasons I put this photo on here is because it's a little bit about perspective, reframing your thoughts. I'm old enough, unfortunately, to have worked in a clinic, two clinics where we had to handwrite our notes. So when I'm in an EMR system and I'm frustrated, sometimes I just have to say, well, thank goodness I'm not handwriting my notes. So reframing your thoughts, having perspective is an important way to combat those burnout symptoms. Moving on to professional development. So it has been shown in a recent study, a great study by Pugliese et al. In 2023, that those who received, and this is for PTs in the US, those who received formal mentorship or informal mentorship displayed significantly lower burnout compared to those who received no mentorship. So this is going back to kind of what we talked about earlier, looking for a place that's going to invest in your development, invest in yourself early on in your career. You might also have to go above and beyond, right? And take that initiative yourself. We're seeing a lot more organizations put mentorship into place. We're seeing more residencies and pushes for residencies, which is essentially like, you know, the most one-on-one mentorship that you can get. But it doesn't have to be formal. This study is showing that it can be informal. It can be what you seek out. And so an example of this would be in the beginning of my career, I was not fortunate to work for a company that had formal mentorship or even provided any sort of support with continuing education. So I did do that above and beyond. And I made that investment in myself. And even though I don't work for that company anymore, I made that investment for myself and I took that education with me for 11 years. So it is worth the investment. And yes, it's important to find a company that supports you, but it's also important to do that individually. I think this is the last strategy that we're going to be talking about. And this is the one that's probably most well researched in psychology, but engaging in self-care and seeking support. So if we know emotional dissonance, which is a part of compassion fatigue, leads to burnout, and we know that holding back what we really want to say can increase burnout, we should be venting. We actually see that venting helps reduce burnout. And I have deemed this professional venting, right? Because that is very different than gossiping or talking about your patients in a negative way. So it has been recommended that you create time for yourself to vent. And this could be to your colleagues. It should be time away from where patients can hear or staff can hear. It can be with your colleagues. It can be with your family and friends. It could be formal. It could be informal, but literature is showing that it does reduce burnout symptoms. Exercise, a strong evidence between exercise and burnout associations. We tend to be, as clinicians who are pretty close to the exercise world, we don't do this very well ourselves. We are so busy and we don't prioritize exercise. So thinking outside of the box and doing some things unique in a unique fashion in your clinic is a great way to get exercise in. So get people together in your clinic to have a weekly exercise after work, or ask your leaders to sponsor an exercise event. Make it a community outreach, right? We do a lot of runs and, participate in those things because exercise is shown to reduce burnout. Vacation, there's also some evidence showing that if you take your PTO, it actually reduces burnout and absenteeism in the end. So that's some great literature across industries, not just healthcare. But what I would like to say here is that a core trait for clinicians should be always raising their hands to cover for teammates that are taking PTO or vacation or need coverage, because it's going to come back to you tenfold. And this is another thing that I did early on in my career. You may think, I'm so exhausted, I might be burned out, I cannot take on an extra shift or help my teammate. You may think that in the short term, it's not a good idea, but in the long term, you covering for your team is going to come back and you're going to be able to take your vacation. I don't think there's been 1 year in my career where I haven't taken all of my PTO because I prioritize it, and it's a core value of mine to cover for others. So think about that in the long term, not the short term. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, challenging those negative thoughts. We talked a lot about that today, so I won't dive too deep here. But I will say, if you're on this call and you are experiencing like severe burnout, imposter syndrome, compassion fatigue, I would reach out to an expert and seek out professional help, because CBT is shown in the literature to reduce those feelings and to be successful with that. And then the last thing we'll talk about is vulnerability. So I am just showing a couple celebrities here who have talked about things like imposter syndrome. We are doing a really good job of naming these issues, burnout presentations, and talking about imposter syndrome. There's become a lot less judgment on these issues, and that's a key first step, right? The key to healing is talking about it, admitting it, being vulnerable. And I just thought it was pretty interesting. I did a quick Google search to see, and I found 23 celebrities who have been quoted talking about imposter syndrome. So you saw the celebrities on the last slide. In this article, some of the examples they included were Tom Hanks, Tina Fey, Serena Williams, and even Maya Angelou, right? And then we've got Albert Einstein from the beginning of the presentation. So it's not a coincidence that people with mega success are likely to feel imposter syndrome and potential burnout syndromes. So I think the biggest like takeaway from today is, let's think about it from that perspective. If I'm having imposter phenomenon feelings, well, I have to be successful in order to even have those feelings. So go me, right? Let's focus on that part of the definition. I am successful. I've worked hard to get here. And I will show you a little my last piece of inspiration. If you don't know Alona Mar, she is a U.S. women's rugby star who won a bronze medal at the U.S. Olympics or the Paris Olympics for the U.S. team in 2024. And she was asked about imposter syndrome, and she said she does not feel imposter syndrome. And she's quoted saying, "I feel like I deserve what I've gotten, and I've worked very hard." So this was so interesting to see, like, talk about challenging negative thoughts and reflecting on how far she has come. She is the first person I have seen publicly say, "Hey, I don't have imposter syndrome." So I challenge you to channel your inner Alona and think about where you've come, reflect on your successes if you're feeling imposter syndrome or feeling burned out. And our very, very last slide is just a way to prevent burnout, is really to evaluate your work environment, whether it's your current work environment or you're interviewing for a work environment. I put 5 questions together based on all of the things that we discussed to look for in a company. You're much less likely to be burned out if the company, advances their clinicians professionally, if they have a clinical support team or a learning and development team with clinicians on the team. Those are questions you want to ask. Informal or formal mentorship. We learned that at this talk. Ask about their quality metrics and talk about them as quality metrics. And then shadow. Figure out what kind of environment it is, because that support and that self-care is important as well. So that ends my talk. I really appreciate everyone for being here. And I am going to pass it off to an IB teammate just to kind of give you guys a little bit of info before we sign off. Thank you for joining, and I hope you guys saw some value in the information presented.
Hi, thank you, Kara. That was very informative, and you're getting some wonderful positive feedback in the chat. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren McGrady. I'm one of the talent acquisition business partners with Ivy. I just wanted to pop on here for the last 2 minutes to share my contact details with you all in case anyone is interested in a career or a part ownership partner opportunity with us. We currently have clinics in 17 states and have many on-site and remote clinical and support staff roles available as a growing organization. So would love to connect. I hope you all enjoyed this wonderful webinar and would love to connect with you further about Ivy as an organization as a potential employer. So that's just my quick details there. And Kara, if you want to hop back on, we can thank them quickly here together. This was a wonderful webinar.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really happy to have gotten to be in front of all of you guys, and I'm going to take a look at the chat. Just wanted to get the information out, and any questions, we would love to connect with you guys. We'll figure out a way. Lauren and our team in the background will figure out a way to connect with you guys if you have any interest in talking further about this. Really appreciate you being here and your engagement. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for attending.